Hello YouTube! Well, this is a video about philosophical theories of perception. I'm going to look at direct realism and representative realism. Now, as the names imply, these two theories are both forms of realism, and that means they're in agreement about a number of points. So, according to both theories, we have our mind. This is the subjective, the mental, the first personal, and then there is the external world outside of us, which is objective, independent of our minds. The external world is pretty much as it seems to be. So suppose that normal perceivers under normal conditions can see and feel a table in a room. Well, that's because there really is a table in that room, and the table and the room are both mind independent. So, according to both theories, we have our minds which perceive with reasonable accuracy the mind-independent external world. This is a completely commonsensical view. It's pretty rare to find anyone these days who disagrees with the picture so far. So, what do the theories disagree on? Well, direct realism, this is sometimes called naive realism. I suppose this is the common sense approach to perception. The idea here is that when we perceive an object in the external world, we perceive it directly with no intermediaries. There is the object, then there is our perception of the object, nothing more is involved. Okay? We're not aware of anything else. Representative realism, this is the claim that we do not perceive the object directly, but indirectly. What we perceive directly is a representation of the object, a mental representation of the object. And this mental representation is known as a sense datum. So the external world is perceived via sense data. So that should be simple enough. Direct realists claim that we perceive the objects themselves directly. Representative realists claim that we perceive sense data which represent the objects. So here are two simple diagrams which show the different views. Representative realism is the claim that all perception is via sense data. Okay, well, first of all then, what exactly are sense data? There are four important properties that sense data are held to have. Firstly, they are private. So that is, nobody else can access my sense data. Only I can experience them. They exist in my head, my mind. I can tell other people about them, I can talk about them to other people, but no one else can access them like I can. Second, they are exactly as they appear. They cannot be misperceived. So if I have a sense datum of a table, I might be mistaken that there's a table, since I might be hallucinating it, but I can't be mistaken that I'm seeing the sense data of a table. Okay, third, they exist only when they're being experienced, so there are no sense data that are not being experienced by someone. And finally, under normal circumstances, they represent things in the external world. Under normal circumstances, if I have the sense data of a table, that's because there is a table out there. The table out there causes my sense data. All right then. So that's the kind of picture there. So why do some philosophers feel that perception of the external world can only obtain via sense data? Direct realism is more intuitive and seems simpler, but it does have some problems. So I'm just going to whiz through some of the objections to direct realism. I suppose I should note that I myself, I'm not at all persuaded by representative realism. This is going to be quite an opinionated introduction, but you'll get the flavour of the debate, I hope. It's worth bearing in mind that many of the arguments against direct realism take the form of noting that what we perceive has or appears to have a certain property, but that the objects in the external world do not have this property. To see this kind of thing at work, consider its classic argument against direct realism, the argument from illusion. There are many variations of this, but one of the favourites in the literature is the stick half submerged in water. So, a stick may be completely straight, but if you place half of it in water, it will look bent. The trouble is that the stick itself is not bent, but evidently we see something bent. So what exactly is it that's bent? The suggestion is it must be sense data. The stick is straight, but when you put the stick half in water, we can see something bent. And the idea is that that's sense data. Personally, I think this is an astonishingly weak argument. There are other ways of running the argument from illusion, but the stick in water example is astonishingly weak. It has nothing to threaten direct realism. Why? Well, because you do not simply perceive the stick, you perceive the stick half submerged in water. When we look at sticks normally, we're just looking at the stick. A stick wholly out of water is a different state of affairs to the same stick half submerged in water. The direct realist can hold, and it's quite reasonable for him to hold, that directly perceiving a stick wholly out of water is different from directly perceiving a stick half submerged in water. Why would we expect those two things to look the same? The optic properties of water are not the same as the optic properties of air. See, this argument from illusion rests on the principle I mentioned, that when it seems to you that something has some property f, then there is something that has that property f. But is that true? Is it true that when something seems to have some property f, there is a thing that has that property? Consider this comment from J.L. Austin. J.L. Austin says, if, to take a rather different case, a church were cunningly camouflaged so that it looked like a barn, how could any serious question be raised about what we see when we look at it? We see, of course, a church that now looks like a barn. We do not see an immaterial barn, an immaterial church, or an immaterial anything else. So the claim that since something appears bent, there is something of which we are immediately aware that is bent, this just reifies the appearances and I think begs the question against the direct realist. Obviously, no direct realist would accept that if something appears bent, there is something of which we are aware that is bent. Think of it this way. We could say that in seeing a half-submerged stick, there are two things, the stick and then the appearance of the stick, which the representative realist identifies with sense data. One, the stick, is straight, and the other, the appearance of the stick, is bent. But putting it this way reifies the appearance. A direct realist can maintain that there's really only one thing here, a stick that looks bent. Nothing really is bent, we just have something that looks bent. And similarly, in Austin's example, we have a church that looks like a barn. By making the church look like a barn, we haven't brought into existence some mysterious, immaterial barn, we simply have a church that looks like a barn. So, the argument from illusion. I said, the stick itself is not bent, but evidently we see something bent, must be sense data. The direct realist can respond, no, we do not see something bent, we see something that looks bent. The claim that there is something that is bent, when a straight stick appears bent, would only be accepted by those who, I think, already reject the direct realist account. But then this can't be an argument against direct realism. Closely related to the argument from illusion is the argument from perceptual variation. Bertrand Russell, in his Problems of Philosophy, asks us to consider a table. This is a perfectly familiar experience. As you move around the room, what you immediately see changes in its apparent size or shape. If we stand on this side of the table, this side will appear longer and this one shorter. If we move around and stand on the other side, well, this will be reversed, obviously. This is obvious stuff. So, the table itself does not change, but what we see does change, hence we do not see the table directly. Obviously, this argument also depends on the assumption that because something appears to have some property f, then there is something that does have that property f. And as we have seen, the direct realist can and should reject this. As far as the direct realist is concerned, the table does not change, and since we see the table, what we see does not change either. Rather, what we see simply appears to change. To argue that because something appears to change, there is something that does change, is, as before, to reify the appearance and to beg the question against the direct realist. It's easy to account for why the table appears to change without invoking sense data or any other perceptual intermediary. There's nothing at all mysterious about perspective distortion. It's no surprise that if you stand in this part of the room, the table may look different than when you stand in this part of the room. Right, another argument related to the argument from illusion is the argument from hallucination. So this starts from the observation that there is no difference between the phenomenology of hallucination and the phenomenology of veridical perception. Phenomenology concerns the structure of one's consciousness and what it's like to experience things from a first-person point of view. So essentially the claim here is that hallucination, to the person having the hallucination, feels just the same as veridical perception. In other words, hallucinating a voice sounds just the same as hearing a real voice. Hallucinating a cup on the table looks just the same as seeing a real cup on the table. And it can produce the same reactions too. If you hallucinate a voice of somebody calling your name, you'll probably respond to it as though it was a real voice. Now, the point is that if you're hallucinating something, you can't be directly perceiving it. In fact, you're not perceiving anything in any sense at all. The hallucination is a product of your mind and has no connection to anything in the external world. But if you're not perceiving anything in the external world when you hallucinate, and if hallucination is phenomenally indistinguishable from, so that is, feels just the same as, veridical perception, then we have reason to believe that you're not perceiving anything in the external world in veridical perception either. They both feel the same, so we should give the same account to both of them. They're both caused by sense data, says the representative realist. So how can the direct realist respond to this? Well, one response is to take the view of disjunctivists, for example John McDowell. Disjunctivists hold that we can invoke sense data to explain hallucinations, but they resist the attempt to generalise from hallucinations to perception. McDowell points out that although there's no phenomenal difference between hallucination and veridical perception, there's a very significant ontological difference. Hallucination and perception are very different things, so it's reasonable to suppose that something different is going on in each case. It's reasonable to give a different explanation for each of them. We can explain hallucination with sense data, but veridical perception can be explained in a different way. We don't have to invoke sense data for each of them. But bear in mind, if we consider looking at a photograph of a rat, this may phenomenally appear the same as a real rat. It's entirely possible to mistake a picture of some object for the real object, but nobody would argue in this case that they're both caused by the same thing. Nobody would try to give the same explanation for each of them in this case. So clearly then, there's no reason to suppose that just because two things appear the same, so i.e. just because hallucination and veridical perception appear the same, that they are in fact the same, or that the same explanation should be given for each of them. So that's disjunctivism. Personally, I'm not so keen on this response because I think direct realists should resist introducing sense data at all. We'll see later in the video that there are some serious problems with the idea of sense data, and I think we should avoid invoking them if we can. Luckily there are some other responses available. So we could hold, for example, that when somebody hallucinates something, they're immediately aware not of sense data, but of their own brain states. Now, to maintain direct realism, we would still need to invoke disjunctivism, otherwise somebody who rejects direct realism could argue that brain states are the objects of immediate awareness in veridical perception too. But the point is, this avoids invoking sense data. Now, another response, which does not involve disjunctivism, is to take the rather counterintuitive approach of holding that in hallucination we do directly perceive external objects. Okay, so how does this work? Well, suppose I hallucinate a rat on a table. There's no rat there. Well, the view of this approach is that in hallucinating the rat, I directly perceive certain objects, say the table or the air around the table, but that I incorrectly perceive them as having properties they don't really have. So hallucination is seen as being essentially an extreme illusion. Recall the stick half submerged in water. In this case, the stick appears to us pretty much as it really is, but it also appears to be bent, which it isn't. So it appears to have a property it doesn't really have. Well, in this view, hallucination is simply a very extreme case of things appearing to have properties they don't really have. Of course, we might point out that hallucinations, unlike the stick in the water, also have a very particular cause. They're caused by incorrect brain function. When we look at the stick, our brain may be functioning perfectly. It appears bent due to the particular optical properties of water. On the other hand, when I hallucinate a rat on a table, something in my brain is misfiring, causing me to perceive incorrectly. So perhaps this could be worked into an objection to this idea. Anyway, moving on. Time lag. The argument from time lag. When we look at the sun, since the light takes 8 minutes to reach us, we're seeing the sun as it was 8 minutes ago. Actually, of course, you shouldn't look at the sun. Let's pretend we've got special glasses on or something. So anyway, we're seeing the sun as it was 8 minutes ago. But then surely we don't directly perceive the sun. Well, just consider. Imagine that the sun suddenly disappears. Well, we'll still see the light for 8 minutes. It can't be the sun that we perceive, since the sun simply isn't there anymore, and it's not possible to perceive something that doesn't exist. Of course, though, we still perceive something, so the object of our perceptions must be something other than the sun. In fact, of course, this is already the case with many stars. It takes the light from many stars billions of years to reach us, and they may have died and disappeared in the interim. We can't perceive those stars since they don't exist anymore, but we perceive something. It must be some intermediary, like sense data. Now, since there is always a time lag, however minute, from the light bouncing or emanating from an object to reaching our eyes, this point generalises to all vision. And of course it generalises to all perception, because there is always a time lag in perception. Indeed, with sounds, for example, the time lag is greater. So, that's the time lag argument. This is a fairly weak argument in my opinion. The direct realist can insist simply that perception is not instantaneous. So we directly perceive things as they used to be. In the case of the sun, we directly perceive it as it was 8 minutes ago. We see into the past. We can perceive things that don't exist. Now, there's perhaps something slightly counterintuitive about this, but I don't think it's that counterintuitive. Why shouldn't we be able to see into the past? I'm not aware of any good reason to think we can't. So unless somebody has a decisive argument there, I don't think the direct realist should feel threatened by the time lag argument. The time lag argument depends on the assumption that we can't see into the past. We can't perceive the past. We can't perceive things that don't exist anymore. But I don't see any reason to accept that assumption at all. Also, it's worth noting that although this argument, the time lag argument, is sometimes given in support of sense data, for example, Russell in Problems of Philosophy gives the time lag argument in support of sense data. It's unclear how it's actually supposed to establish sense data. In fact, it obviously doesn't support sense data. All that follows from the argument, as far as I can see, all that follows from it, if it's successful, and I don't think it is, but if it's successful, all that follows is that we don't see the sun directly, rather we see the light from the sun directly. Light waves aren't sense data, they're part of the material world. If we see light waves directly, we still have a form of direct realism. Of course, it would be a fairly weak kind of direct realism. Most direct realists would want to resist this conclusion. Most direct realists hold that we directly see the sun and other objects, not just light waves. Hold this thought, because actually I'm going to come back to this point a bit later. The point for now is just that time lag gives us no reason to believe in sense data, even if the time lag argument is successful, which I don't think it is. Right then, the argument from secondary qualities. So a famous distinction in philosophy is between primary and secondary qualities of objects. This distinction was most forcefully presented by Locke. Primary qualities are held to be completely mind-independent qualities of objects. Objects have them independently of any observer. Shape, speed, solidity, number, electrical charge, and so on are all primary qualities. Primary qualities are investigated by the physical sciences. They can be described mathematically, and so on. Secondary qualities, on the other hand, at least seem to be observer-dependent and subjective. Colour, taste, smell, all these are secondary qualities. These are all dependent upon how we perceive the objects. So it seems, prima facie, that the world in itself is not really coloured. Rather, there are certain wavelengths of light which stimulate our retinas in particular ways, and this gives rise to our subjective experience of colour. But neither the objects that the wavelengths of light come from, nor the wavelengths of light themselves are literally coloured, and both can be explained wholly by invoking primary qualities. So that is, the wavelengths of light have only the properties of speed and frequency and so on, and the objects that they come from have properties of shape and number, etc. And in giving a full account of the external world, we don't need secondary qualities. It does seem to be true that primary qualities are explanatorily basic. Now, the original claim from Locke was that our ideas of primary qualities resemble primary qualities in the object, but our ideas of secondary qualities don't resemble anything in the object at all. When I look at, for example, an apple, the shape I see resembles the shape of the apple, but the colour I see doesn't resemble anything in the apple. The colour is caused by light bouncing off the apple, but seeing the colour doesn't seem to be like detecting wavelengths of light, and the apple itself doesn't contain any colour. Now, not all representative realists accept Locke's idea of resemblance, but here's the basic view. The primary qualities we perceive, in some sense, represent things in the world, whereas secondary qualities are just in our own heads. They're only in our heads. So the argument goes that since secondary qualities do not actually exist in the external world, we cannot perceive secondary qualities directly. They must be a product of something else, like sense data. And furthermore, since everything we perceive has one secondary quality or another, everything we see has a colour, for example, sense data must be invoked for all our perceptions. So how does the direct realist respond? Well, I want to focus on colour in particular because that's what most of the literature has focused on. So the argument goes, since colours do not exist in the external world, we cannot perceive colours directly. They must be a product of sense data. And obviously it follows from this that since everything we see has one colour or another, sense data must be invoked for all visual experience. Right. How to respond to this argument? Well, one option for the direct realist is simply to identify colour with particular primary qualities, which then allows him to hold that actually colours do exist in the external world. On this view, objects are objectively coloured, just as they objectively have a certain shape, and hence it's entirely possible to perceive colours directly. So how could colour be identified with primary qualities? Well, we may hold that colour is simply the spectral reflective properties of the object. Now, let's consider a very simplified example and suppose that this object has a particular kind of surface that causes it to absorb everything except light with a wavelength of 650 nanometers, so that is what we would call red light. And this one has a different kind of surface that causes it to absorb everything except light with a wavelength of 475 nanometers. That is blue. Now, the direct realist might hold that colour is reducible to these different properties of the surfaces of objects. So to say that an object is red is really to say that it has such and such kind of surface, and that when we see a red object, we directly perceive the reflective properties of this kind of surface. Of course, you might need to adjust this account a little bit. With translucent objects, you wouldn't necessarily perceive the surface, but you get the point. To say that an object is red is just to say that it has certain kinds of reflective properties. And to say it's blue is to say it has certain other kinds of reflective properties. Now, there is a problem with this approach, and it concerns a phenomenon called metamerism. This is the phenomenon where two objects with different reflective properties appear to be the same colour, even under the same conditions. Now, if two objects both have different reflective properties, but they also both have completely indistinguishable colours, surely their colour cannot be identified with the reflective properties. Surely the reflective properties and the colour must be different if there can be a change in one without a change in the other. Well, I'm not sure this is a very powerful objection, since we can simply alter the argument and identify colours with sets of reflective properties or types of reflective properties. So to say that an object is red is to say it has this kind of surface, or this kind of surface, or this kind of surface, and so on. Really, all the fact that different reflective properties can appear the same colour tells us is that we're not capable of making perfect discriminations, and there's nothing remotely surprising about this. Bear in mind, incidentally, that the term red already refers to many different shades of colour, because there are many shades of red. I think a much more powerful objection to the direct realist account here would be if we found two surfaces with the same reflective properties, but that appear a different colour under the same conditions. I'm not aware that there are any such surfaces, though. As long as we never have a situation where the same reflective properties are perceived as having a different colour under the same conditions, and where this is a case of correct perception, not hallucination or whatever, I think it's fine to identify colour with reflective properties. Right. In any case, there is a second reply open to the direct realist. The direct realist can argue that secondary qualities are powers in objects to produce experiences in us. So this response accepts that secondary qualities are observer dependent, but holds that we still see them directly because they're defined relative to us. When we see a coloured object, we directly perceive the object's power to produce in us a certain kind of experience. So essentially, to be red is just to look red to normal observers in normal conditions. Now, of course, you can ask what exactly counts as a normal observer in normal conditions. First answer might be that the observer needs to have their visual system functioning properly, that there needs to be a certain amount of white light, that there shouldn't be any interfering medium like fog or whatever. But there's a problem. Imagine an alien race, say from Mars, who have very different neurobiology. Is it not possible that what looks red to normal humans might look green to normal Martians? Right, so the claim here then is that secondary qualities are powers to produce experiences, but they produce different experiences in different beings. Grass is green to us, in the sense that grass is green to normal humans under normal conditions, and grass is red to them, in that it looks red to normal Martians under normal conditions. In a sense then, grass is both green and red. Is this idea so ridiculous? After all, if you take X and put it with Y, it may produce a different effect than if you take X and put it with Z. Think of chemical reactions. If you mix vinegar and baking soda, you'll get a very violent reaction, but if you mix vinegar and soil, nothing will happen. For perhaps a more relevant example, imagine that the Martians have a fisheye style lens in their eyes. Well, this would induce different experiences of primary qualities, since lines which we would call straight would appear to them in a way that we would call bent. So it's not so ridiculous to say that the same wavelengths of light may produce different reactions in different creatures. Doesn't follow that secondary qualities only exist in our minds or that we can't perceive them directly. Secondary qualities are powers to produce experiences, but they produce different experiences in different creatures. And actually, primary qualities produce different experiences in different creatures too. Right then, that's the secondary qualities argument. Here is the causal chain argument. Now, earlier, when we looked at the time lag argument, we saw that it could be argued that we do not see the sun directly, rather we see the light coming from the sun directly. This kind of consideration leads to the causal chain argument. Consider what's involved in seeing something. First, waves of light either bounce off or are emitted by an object. These waves of light have to travel through a medium, usually air. The light waves hit the retinal cells, which convert them into information that's sent down the optic tract through the lateral geniculate nucleus, and then this sends the information to the visual cortex, and so on. At some point near the end of a complex series of processes, we consciously perceive things. Obviously, a similar story can be told for every other sensory modality. So, the argument goes, we cannot directly perceive things in the world. If I'm looking at a cup, there are a whole series of processes between that cup and my seeing the cup. Indeed, we know that my very own brain alters and transforms the information from the cup in various ways before I become aware of it. Now, this argument seems to be quite popular these days. I think it rests on a straightforward and obvious confusion. It confuses how we perceive with what we perceive. An obvious confusion. These causes that I mentioned, all these complex causes, these are simply conditions that make seeing the object possible. The object causes us to see it, but it alone is not causally sufficient. We also need the right light, open eyes, correct functioning of the retina, and so on. So yes, many things go on in the brain and in the retina, but we do not actually perceive any of this. We're completely unaware of all of this. All of this is just part of how perception functions. It's not what we actually perceive. When, this information, say, information is sent down the optic tract, okay, yes, that's necessary for perception. But that's part of how we perceive. It's not part of what we perceive. That's just part of how perception functions. We don't actually perceive information going down the optic tract. To fully understand the trouble with the causal argument, it's perhaps useful to make a distinction between causal indirectness and cognitive indirectness. So perception of X is causally indirect if there is at least one causal intermediary Y between X and the perceiver. Perception of X is cognitively indirect if perception of X involves prior awareness of some other object Y. The causal argument successfully refutes causal directness of perception. But direct realists don't need to be committed to the claim that perception is causally direct. The question is whether it's cognitively direct. When I perceive the cup of water in front of me, does this involve prior awareness of some other object, a sense data, say? The intuitive answer is no, and obviously the causal argument does not bear on this question. Consider, for example, the case of light. Just think about these two questions. Can you see the glass? Can you see the light reflecting off the glass? The point is that there's an obvious difference between seeing light and seeing by means of light. Seeing by means of light is how seeing functions, it's how seeing works. Seeing light, on the other hand, requires special optical circumstances. So just because the detection of light waves from the object are a necessary condition of perception doesn't follow that you perceive the light rather than the object. And that's the case with every other causal intermediary. So I think the causal argument is, as I say, a very weak argument, and it straightforwardly confuses how we perceive with what we perceive. How we perceive, yes, that does require a whole bunch of complex processes, but what we perceive can still be the object out there in the world. It's worth noting, incidentally, that even all of these arguments we've seen, even if any of these arguments did successfully refute direct realism, I think most of them would not successfully establish representative realism, at least in terms of sense data. So that is, these arguments might be arguments against direct realism, but they're not arguments in favour of sense data. We've already seen this in the case of time lag, but consider, for example, the causal chain argument. How on earth is that supposed to establish the existence of sense data? Let's say the argument is successful. Let's say that if, when I perceive X, there is a causal intermediary Y between X and my perception, then I do not directly perceive X. For example, between the cup in front of me and myself, light waves are a causal intermediary. Okay, so I don't perceive the cup directly, but this doesn't mean that I perceive sense data. Instead, I perceive light waves directly, or I perceive the pattern of stimulation on my retina directly, or whatever. The point is, we don't really have representative realism. Now, of course, most direct realists wouldn't be happy with this conclusion either, but that's beside the point. The causal chain argument is not an argument for sense data, and it's just worth kind of bearing that in mind, that just because something is an argument against direct realism doesn't mean that it's an argument for sense data. And I think that's the case with many of the arguments that we've seen. Right then, so those were some arguments against direct realism. I don't think any of them are successful. In fact, I think most of them are pretty easy to defend oneself against. But now let's have a look at some arguments against representative realism, because representative realism does have plenty of its own problems. Right then, first of all, according to the representative realist, sense data are exactly how they seem. We cannot be mistaken about our sense data. They have exactly the properties they seem to have. Now, Roderick Chisholm's example of looking at a speckled hen poses a problem here. Take this speckled hen. Now, without trying to count, how many speckles does it have? I bet that most of you don't know, without trying to count. So now the question is, how many speckles are there in your sense data? Well, a natural response is that your sense data have the same number of speckles as there are on the hen. But if this is the case, then since sense data have exactly the properties they seem to have, you should immediately know how many speckles there are. But we don't. The most we can say is more than 10 and less than 15. I mean, that's my kind of intuitive reaction to that. Maybe yours is different, but you don't immediately know, without trying to count, how many speckles there are on that hen. Now, A.J. Ayer argued that in this case, the number of speckles in the sense data is literally indeterminate. So there are an indeterminate number of speckles in the sense data. Some problems here. First of all, we can ask, what exactly is an indeterminate number? Is it possible for something to be literally indeterminate? It's fair enough to say that something looks indeterminate to me. It's quite another to say that it literally is indeterminate. It's very questionable whether we should countenance the existence of genuinely indeterminate objects. But in any case, even if we accept that the sense data is indeterminate, this doesn't really solve the problem. For imagine now that we decide to count the speckles. It's not too hard. It takes a couple of seconds to see that there is a group of six speckles, there's a group of 6 speckles, so we know that there are 12 speckles. And because we've mentally grouped these 6 and these 6, we can immediately perceive the 12 speckles. Well, in this case, accepting that sense data are exactly how they seem, it seems that the sense data before counting the speckles had an indeterminate number of speckles, while the sense data after counting the speckles had a determinate number of 12 speckles. But the sense data themselves don't change. We see the same thing each time. The sense data are the same each time. So how can that be? Before counting, it's indeterminate. After counting, there are 12. Right, a related problem concerns inconsistent appearances. There are many illusions which appear to have inconsistent properties. I'm sure you've seen some of these before. This is an impossible Necker cube. Here's an impossible Penrose triangle. Here are some impossible Penrose stairs. All of these appear to be inconsistent. The Penrose stairs forever go up, but never get higher. Okay, they're not really inconsistent, they're illusions, and it's quite clear how the illusion of inconsistency is generated in each case. We all understand how these things work, but this doesn't matter. The point is that they appear inconsistent. So if sense data have just the properties they appear to have, then the sense data of these objects must have inconsistent properties. So it seems that there can be things with inconsistent properties. Contradictions can exist. That's a fairly difficult conclusion for many people to accept. So, indeterminate appearances, inconsistent appearances, those are a problem for any sense data theory. Okay, next, where are sense data located? Well, it seems that the only plausible answer is that they're located somewhere in the brain. But if they're brain states, well, one's brain states do not generally have the properties they appear to have. The brain state of an apparently bent stick submerged in water is no more bent than the stick is. Similarly, if somebody looks at a red square and then we look inside their brain, we don't find any redness in there. So basically, we posit sense data because the world doesn't have the properties it seems to have. By definition, sense data have just the properties they appear to have. But if we locate sense data in the brain, no brain state has the properties the world seems to have either. Sense data can't be brain states. So where else can they be located? Well, this really actually is just part of a broader problem. These days, most philosophers are physicalists or materialists. So physicalists reject ghosts, gods, spirits, demons, souls, and so on. Essentially, they're only willing to countenance the existence of the entities that are dealt with in empirical sciences like physics, biology, chemistry. So obviously then, they hold that the human mind is a product of the human brain in one way or another. And the trouble with sense data is that it's difficult to see how they could be made to cohere with this general philosophical picture. Of course, it's worth pointing out that mental states in general have a difficulty here. So it's unclear that sense data are in any worse of a position. But that's perhaps, one reason why some philosophers feel uncomfortable with sense data. Now, historically, the biggest problem for representative realism is the veil of perception. I want you to consider looking at a map that's supposed to represent a piece of land. How do we know whether the map is accurate or not? Well, it's simple. We can know it by examining the map, and then examining the land it's supposed to represent, and checking if they match. We can see both the map and the land, so we can check that they match accurately. Now the question is, if all we ever perceive is sense data, how do we know that these sense data accurately represent the external world? Couldn't the external world be very different from how our sense data represent it? Couldn't there simply be no external world at all? Here's the problem. If we only ever perceive sense data, we can't look through the sense data to check how well they match up to the world. We can't look through them to the world outside, so we can't see how well they match up. If we imagine sense data as being like a map, we can never examine the land that the map is supposed to represent. So the trouble then is that the representative part of representative realism kind of pulls the rug out from under the realist part. The problem for the representative realist is how we can possibly justify being realists if all we ever perceive are representations. Now, how can we respond to this? Well, one response is to argue that this objection misunderstands the representative realist theory. It's not that the sense data create a veil between the perceiver and external objects. Rather, sense data is simply the medium by which objects are perceived. Now, I don't think this can work. The problem is that if sense data is simply the medium by which objects are perceived, then the theory, it seems to me, collapses into a form of direct realism. Recall again the distinction we drew between causal intermediaries and cognitive intermediaries. We saw that perception of X is causally indirect. If there is at least one causal intermediary Y between X and the perceiver, perception of X is cognitively indirect if it involves prior awareness of some other object Y. And we also saw that causal indirectness of perception is entirely compatible with direct realism. If Y is merely a causal intermediary between X and the perceiver, then the perceiver doesn't actually perceive Y. When we look at a table, we need light to see the table, but we don't see the light, we see the table, except in certain special circumstances. Now, if sense data are held to be part of the medium by which objects are perceived, then sense data are merely a causal intermediary, and we don't actually perceive them. But sense data are perceived by definition, so that can't be right. And even if it could be right, even if it could be the case that sense data are part of the medium by which objects are perceived, if we don't actually perceive sense data, then we just have direct realism. There seems little point introducing sense data at all if we don't actually perceive them. But as long as we perceive them, as long as we have prior awareness of sense data in order to have awareness of external objects in the world, then the veil of perception problem clearly stands. Another classic response is to argue that beliefs about the external world are justified by a kind of inference to the best explanation. Bertrand Russell and J.L. Mackie give this kind of argument. Consider an analogy with science. We can never directly observe a quark, but we know that quarks exist because the theory that posits quarks is extremely successful. That is, the predictions it makes are verified and it gives a very good account of the behaviour of macroscopic bodies. The best explanation for the success of a theory is that the entities posited by the theory really exist. So there's a kind of inference to the best explanation. In the case of sense data, there are things that need explaining. In particular, we need to explain the order, the coherence, the continuity that our sensations have. So there's a few things to consider here. First, note that we cannot produce our sensations at will. We can't produce our sense data at will. If I want to have the sensation of eating a chocolate cake, I have to actually pick up a chocolate cake and actually eat it. I can't just will myself to have those sensations. Second, note that different sensory modalities agree with each other. If I do start eating a chocolate cake, I will receive many kinds of sensory information. I will see the cake, taste it, smell it, hear myself chewing it, and so on. Note in particular how the smell of a cake seems so connected to the taste of a cake. If you have a cold and your nose is bunged up so you can't smell the cake properly, you won't be able to taste it properly. So there's a very, very strong coherence and agreement between different senses. And finally, the same kinds of sense data show continuity over time. If I'm currently, say I'm looking at my computer now. If I leave the room and then come back, the computer will still be here. Or take a plant near my window. If I leave for a week or so, then come back, the plant will still be here, but it will be slightly higher. This is something plants in general do. They grow. So there's a great deal of continuity and coherence with our sensations. If I left the room and came back and my computer had disappeared, it would be a shock and I would have to assume it had been stolen or something like that. That kind of thing, doesn't happen without good reason. So the question is, how do we explain these features? Our lack of control, the coherence, the continuity. Well, the suggestion is that the best explanation for this is that external physical objects really exist and that our sense data represent them in a reasonably accurate way. The reason my sense data of my plant are coherent is that there really is a plant there that the sense data represent. Okay, I can't directly see the plant, but I can't directly see quarks either, and that doesn't stop us positing them or believing in them. Okay, some problems with this response, I think. First of all, is it really the case that the existence of material objects is the best explanation for those features of our sensations? Certainly not everybody thought so. Berkeley, for example, held that God was the cause of our sensations. It's not clear why this shouldn't be just as good an explanation as the existence of material objects. God seems to be a simpler explanation, for one thing. I mean, obviously positing the existence of material objects is more commonsensical, but just because something's intuitive doesn't necessarily mean it has any better connection to reality. It's also, of course, worth bearing in mind with the analogy that I gave to science, that there are all sorts of anti-realist accounts of science where quarks are held not to exist, where there are plenty of philosophers of science who are, say, instrumentalists about it, and they think that quarks are just perhaps useful tools for explaining macroscopic phenomena. They don't really exist. I mean, we don't need to get into that here, but it's certainly not clear that this kind of inference to the best explanation is in fact an appropriate way of reasoning. But more seriously, for this kind of response, all the characteristics of seemingly veridical sense data that are in need of explanation can be found in at least some dreams and hallucinations too. Now, granted, many dreams are completely crazy, but at least some dreams exhibit order, coherence, continuity. Some dreams are fairly normal and pedestrian, and are just like waking experiences. Similarly for some hallucinations. Obviously, though, we don't assume that the reason dreams and hallucinations have these features is that they accurately represent things in the external world. There's some other cause in their case. So why shouldn't there be some other cause in the case of seemingly veridical sense data too? And granted, in the case of seemingly veridical sense data, we may not have any idea what this other cause might be, whereas with dreams and hallucinations, we understand those processes quite well. But that isn't the point. The point is that dreams and hallucinations demonstrate that we do not need to invoke material objects to explain features like lack of control, order, continuity, coherence, and so on. There's no good reason to suppose that material objects are the best explanation for those things. Overall, then, I think inference to the best explanation is a fairly weak response to the skeptical challenge. I think perhaps a better response is to argue that skepticism like this is a problem for everybody. Really, the veil of perception is just a form of extreme skepticism tailored to the theory of sense data. But the fact is, whatever your preferred theory of perception, it's always possible to doubt that the external world is how it appears to be, or that there is an external world at all. You could just be hallucinating, you could be a brain in a vat, and so on and so on. Everybody is subject to doubts such as these. Direct realism rules these kinds of scenarios out only by assuming that they don't obtain. The direct realist simply assumes that there is an external world and that the external world is as it seems to be. Well, if a direct realist is entitled to make this assumption, why shouldn't the representative realist do the same? I think that philosophical skepticism, this extreme skepticism of the external world, I would say that's tangential to these theories of perception. I think that's a different question. So I'm not really sure it's fair to attack the representative realist on this point. Well, that was an introduction to the debate between direct realists and representative realists. There are, of course, many other theories of perception, but those are the two we saw in this video. That was an opinionated introduction, I know, so oh well. I hope you enjoyed it anyway, and thanks for watching. Goodbye.